All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome to the sixth lesson in the prep course walkthrough series for Origin Code Academy. Today we'll be continuing on from last week where we left off with JavaScript functions. So we went through conditional statements, operators. Last week we had a pretty short session, I would say. We only got through one set of exercises, so today we'll try to get through two more. Hey, Giovanna, just saw your message. Glad you're here, tuned in with us. Feel free to ask any questions as we move along through the webinar. Go ahead and just throw them in the chat section, and I'll be able to address them now or possibly at the end of the webinar. So for any of you just tuning in, and if this is your first webinar in the walkthrough series, I'll just give you a brief overview. So if you check out the URL here in the browser, it's prep.origincodeacademy.com. And if you go to that URL with the /prep course sign up, you can go and fill in your information and get started for free on the first three courses of our curriculum at Origin Code Academy. So that includes Web 100, HTML and CSS, Node 100, programming with Node.js and JavaScript. And then finally, there's Web 101, which dives a little deeper into HTML and CSS, and then adding JavaScript and jQuery on top of that. So we are in the middle of the second course, Node 100, and we have gotten through quite a few lessons, and we're on to JavaScript functions. So here we're already on the exercises, but we can go back and look at the written lesson and check out first the definition. So functions allow you to create a block of code that can be called at any time. So very powerful. It's actually how a lot of programming gets done in JavaScript. It's how we make things happen, pretty much. And so we can see a very simple example here. A function called say hello. So this is the name of the function here. And then this is what they mean by a block of code. A block of code is everything in between these brackets, which we often call curly braces when you're talking about code. So this is the code that will be executed whenever we call that function at any time. Here, they define the function and then immediately call it right after. And so if we run the function say hello, that's going to log the word hello to the console. So that's just a pretty basic example of a JavaScript function, defining it and then calling it. Now that function doesn't have any parameters in it, so here's an example of a function that takes two parameters, A and B, and it looks like it just adds those two A and B together. So in previous lessons, we've talked about declaring variables. Pretty much passing in an argument to a function is also the same as declaring a variable named A and then another variable named B. And then now you can manipulate or do things with those variables. In this case, add two numbers will add A and B, which would evaluate to some number most likely. So here you can see an example of calling the function add two numbers, passing in two numbers, and then if you can kind of just abstract that away and think about it like now we come in here and A is equal to 2 and B is also equal to 2. And so then we can get into some more examples of what would actually happen when we call this function. Then it talks a little bit about scope. In JavaScript, a scope is created anytime we define a new function. And so now the scope can kind of be thought of as between these between these braces or inside of this block. We have a scope that anything outside of this function doesn't have access to the variables inside of this function. And so That's called the inside-out approach. We can only find the value of this variable a inside of these blocks. So if we were to go below this line, our program wouldn't know what a is outside this block. So that's a brief overview about functions. Looks like back in our exercises, we only have about 4 exercises to get through, so a pretty quick lesson. We'll go ahead and dive right into that. Looks like our first test revolves around defining functions. So we learned a little bit about that. Define a function called myName that returns your name as a string. So declaring variables, declaring functions, everything pretty much starts with var or variable. So we'll declare a variable. Actually, when you're defining a function, you can do it several ways. I think for the purposes of this exercise, we'll keep it simple, and we'll just write the function keyword, space, and then the name of the function, which they specify as myName. Open and close parentheses. This one is not going to take any parameters, so we'll leave the parentheses empty. And then a block where we can execute some code. So here it just asks us to return our name as a string. I'll go ahead and throw my name in there. And now we have a function called myName that returns Christian McFarland. So if we give that a test, actually let's see. Yes, so that is passing. And we're able to move on to the next lesson. We can see the similarities. We'll move on, and then we can see the similarities in this other example where it returns something. But in this case, we just returned my name instead of in addition. All right, so in level 2, now we're going to invoke functions. So we learned about defining them. Now we're going to invoke or call our function. Invoke is just another fancy programming term for calling or executing that function. So define a function named myFullName that uses my first name function to return your full name. So now we're going to see how 2 functions can work together. First, we have one function already defined called myFirstName, and that should just return my first name. And then it's asking us to create a new function called myFullName. And this should grab the return value from my first name, and we can do that by saying var first name equals, and then we'll invoke my first name. So we'll just grab my first name, and we'll invoke it using the parentheses syntax. So my first name should execute, return the string Christian, and assign that to the variable first name. So now first name should contain my first name, and then we need to return something from this function. So we could say, we declare another variable called last name, and just give it a hard-coded string value. And then we can use string concatenation, which we learned about in previous lessons, and return our first name plus a space plus our last name. And that should give us our full name. So here we already had a function named myFirstName defined. Then we declared or defined another function called myFullName, and we used the myFirstName function to return our value of my first name and assign it to the variable first name. Then we hard-coded the last name as a string, and now we simply return all of them together. We could do this another way. If we take if we declare another variable called full name and assign that to the contents of first name plus a space plus last name, then we can just return full name. So that kind of cleans up the code, makes it a little easier to read. The variable names are very descriptive, and that's good, good practice right there. So now we have first name, last name, full name is the two of them together, and then we return full name. So let's give that a test. And it looks like we are passing. All right, so that's invoking functions. Next, we'll talk about parameters. So our last functions that we worked with did not take any parameters, and they did not do anything with those variables. So we go ahead and hit start. Looks like we have no boilerplate code. It's all up to us this time. First, it's asking us to define a function called put together. So function put together that has two parameters. So now instead of the parentheses being blank, we can do kind of what we saw earlier and give it two parameters, one called A and one called B. So that should satisfy the first line. Second, write code to return the value of concatenating A, the AND character, and B. So similar to what we did the last time, we're going to say var return value, or whatever you'd like to name your variable, equals A, and then using the concatenation syntax of just the plus sign, then it wants us to return the symbol AND in between that, and then pack the B onto the end of that string. So now we should have a string that contains whatever the contents of A are, plus the actual character of the ampersand symbol, plus the B, whatever the variable B evaluates to. So, for example, if the value of A is hello and the value of B is world, the return value would be hello and world. Let's give that a test. And it did not pass because we forgot to actually call the keyword return, and we need to return our return value. So now we have actually satisfied the exit criteria, and we're ready to move on. All right, defining variables within functions. So this deals with the scope lesson that we talked about. The scope of a function, as we said before, is limited to whatever is between these blocks. Then everything inside the blocks will have access to the variables created in those blocks, as well as outside in the global scope. So my car has access to all the variables declared within it itself, as well as any variables declared in the global scope. So let's see what the exit criteria is asking us. It's saying to update the myCar function to return forward by inserting code only on line 5. So it looks like they're trying to console log car name, and they're returning car name. So when myCar first gets called, car name has been declared first and already contains the string fiat. So myCar, as is right now, will return the string fiat. However, we can take this variable car name and we can actually assign it a new value within our function scope. And so first it's defined as fiat. However, as soon as our myCar function is called, we can update that variable or reassign it to a new string with the word forward inside. And so by the time it gets to this return car name. Car name has already been reassigned or changed to the word Ford instead of Fiat. And so that's a little bit about scope. As you can see, we don't need to redeclare our variable car name because it's already declared in the outer scope. So if we give that a test, okay. So it is asking us to define a whole new variable. So while car name is already defined in the global scope, and we could access it here within our local function scope, it's asking us to return car name without changing the global variable. So it says global car name variable should not change. And so either way would work. However, if we wanted to use this car name from the global scope below our other function, for example, to console log it, if we don't want it to change, then we'll just declare another variable inside of our local scope here. And so now car name within this function only lives here. And by the time it gets outside of this function, car name in the global scope is still Fiat. So that's a little bit about defining variables and functions. We could define as many as we'd like in here. And then they would only be accessible within the scope of our function. And outside the function, the variable test would not exist. So hopefully that makes sense. If anyone has questions, of course, throw them in the chat channel, and I can pause and spend some more time on this. It's an important concept to grasp. So hopefully you all are following along. All right, so we're moving on, and we have finished level 5 exercises about functions. So we're ready to move on to the next lesson. All right, now we are getting into objects. Let me take a little sip of my drink. All right, what is an object? A JavaScript object is a container for values and a way to give our data some structure. So x equals object. There's several ways to declare an object. Looks like we can use the object keyword, which is reserved in JavaScript for creating objects and manipulating them. There's a few methods built into the object class. We can also use the curly braces or brackets that we talked about earlier. So we saw those when defining a code block, but they also represent an empty object when there's nothing in there. So as you can see, they're declaring a variable named z and assigning it an object with one property inside, and that's called test property. And test property has the value of the number 10. And so you can add, you can create multiple properties by separating them with a comma. And you can pretty much add as many properties to the object as you'd like. And it's a way to store data about something and keep it all in one place and keep it all relevant. So we'll get more into that as we get into the exercises. So Z now has two properties, and you access them in one of two ways, dot or bracket notation. So now our variable Z has two properties, and we can access them by calling Z dot test property, which will return the value 10. The same if we said Z dot other property would return the value anything, the string anything. So the other way is to use bracket notation. instead of using the dot, you can put the name of the property within square brackets, and as long as it's a string value. You can also set new properties on existing objects. So here we see that Z is an object with two properties, one called test property, one called other property. We don't see one called test when we're defining it. However, you can add it on the fly in JavaScript, which is pretty neat. It's very handy if you need to store more data on your object. So z.test equals 20. We're assigning it now. Here we're calling it, and here we're assigning it a new value. And you can assign it the same two ways that you call it, using the dot notation or the bracket notation. Object nesting. So objects can also contain can also be nested within other objects. So you can use the same syntax to get all the values of properties of nested objects using dot notation or bracket notation. And just a little helpful hint, you can combine the dot and bracket notation, however, it's not recommended. So if you are kind of sticking with one way, if you're starting with dots, you should continue with dots, and if you're starting with bracket notation, you should continue using bracket notation. Just a helpful hint there. So if we move on to the next lesson, it looks like this is a Scrimba lesson. For any of you just tuning in who are unfamiliar with the Scrimba platform, it's an extremely valuable learning tool when learning how to code. It's pretty much a screencast, as you may have seen before. If you've looked into other programming tutorials and that type of thing, usually it's you can see the computer screen and then you hear somebody talking in the background explaining a coding lesson. Here it's the same idea. You click play. You're looking at a code editor, and you have an instructor speaking in the background. He's also typing code as he's speaking about it, so he's kind of explaining what he's doing. The cool part is you can pause the lesson at any time and jump in and actually edit this code. So you're pretty much now in your own text editor, you're in your own code editor, and you can change these values. So like, let's see, if we wanted to say these were A and B instead of X and Y, then we'll just say A and B equals Y, and return Y. So now we've kind of played around with the code. Then when we click play again, our code gets reversed and it jumps right back into the lesson. However, if you want to see those changes that you made, if let's say you made some notes in here, I want to remember this part of the lesson, something like that. And then you click play, it jumps right back to the lesson. You can skip around. And then you can always go over to this menu over here and see your local edits at any point in the code. So at 2:54, I wanted to remember that part of the lesson. So, I took some notes here, and they're always accessible over here in the notes section. So this is Scrimba, and an invaluable tool when learning how to code, because you can hear the lesson and then immediately begin to apply that lesson and pretty much add that to your tool bag. So this is super cool. I urge anyone who hasn't signed up yet to sign up and even just to jump in and mess around with this code editor. It'll be a great way to determine if you even enjoy this or if you like coding at all. You're going to want to get in here and make your own changes and start seeing how the console behaves and how the different features of JavaScript. So a lot of fun, very valuable. I won't go through the whole video. You guys can definitely watch that on your own. we will just go ahead and jump right into the functions objects exercises. So we'll move on to the next lesson, and let's see how many we have to work through. Okay, so this looks like a pretty short set of exercises, only 3 to work through. So let's take a crack at it. So, object 1. Update the variable x assignment to include a property called y, which is set to 10. So x is declared up above, and it's set to an empty object. So it contains no properties and no values at this time. However, let's see, update the object below. Okay, so it wants us to open up the object, as we saw in the example, and give it a property of y. So, and the value should be 10. So we saw that in the lesson. We have an object with one property, and the value of that property y is 10. So next, it's asking us to, on a new line, create another property of x called test and set it to this is a test. So there's 2 ways we could do that, as we saw before. We can just add the property this way. So now x will have 2 properties, one called y and one called test. And the value of test should be a string this time, containing the text, this is a test. The other way we could do it is to erase that, and just below the variable declaration, we can say x.test equals this is a test. So let's try to pass it that way, and it looks like it's going to work. And just out of curiosity, I'm going to do it the other way and see if the test will still pass. All right, looks like the tests pass both ways, so it's good to know. If anyone out there has a preference, then you can do it either way. All right, moving on to lesson 2 out of 3 for JavaScript objects. This is called Object 2. Define a variable called product info. All right, easy enough. We've done this plenty of times so far, just declaring a variable called product info using the var keyword. And then the second exit criteria says set product info to an value to an object with a property name and set its value with a property name and set its value to bananas. So we assign the variable product info to the value of an object, and within that object, it should have one property called name, and that value should be bananas, the string bananas. Then the final piece of the exit criteria says add a new property to the product info object called ID and set its value to 1001. So very similar to the last one. It's just another object with 2 properties, one string and one number of 1001. So now if we give that a test, we do have a property called name, and they should have the correct value. So if we change that to 1002, looks like our tests are not passing, so we just want to make sure that our product info object has 2 properties, name with the string bananas, and ID with the number 1001. All right, let's see what level 3 has. So if we hit start, all right, now we're getting into a little more complex code. We already have some boilerplate code or some variables already defined for us. Let's see what it's asking us to do. Update the dig variable to reach the number 2 using the path x, then y, then w. Okay. So we saw this in the example. You can chain the dot notation or bracket notation. I'll try to show you both ways. So first, it gives us a little more of a hint here using x, y, then w. Update the dig variable to reach the number 2. So we see the number 2 is here, assigned to w, which is a property of the y object. Y is then itself a property of the x object. And so in order to get all the way down there, it's fairly intuitive. You would just separate them all with dots. You could say x dot y dot w. And so now we would have access to the variable w, which contains the value 2. And then using a similar syntax, now the number 12 is buried all the way under z and c. So instead of y and w, I'll show you now using the bracket notation. First, it takes z, and then buried within the z object under c is 12. And so we can just access it that way using bracket notation. So we give that a test. All right. And just for demonstration purposes, we can use the dot notation as well. All right. So that was a pretty important lesson. Hopefully I didn't go over it too quickly. If anyone has questions, of course, reach out in the chat section, or you can email or call here at origincodeacademy.com, and you'll find all of our contact information there. If you're already in the prep program, then you have access to this Slack channel link up here. And there's lots of conversations going on in here. We have a few folks going through, and they're asking questions about the questions that they're stuck on, and people are able to jump in. Sometimes I give them a hand. Sometimes other students who have gone through it before will give you a hand. But yeah, JavaScript objects are pretty much how you store data and how data gets moved around. So important lesson here. If you missed it, go back and watch it, and read the lessons and watch the Scrimba lessons, and you'll be all caught up. For the rest of us, we'll be moving on to, let's see, level 7, loops. So now we are in the last part of Node 100. Great job, everybody who's made it to this point. And after this, we only have one more course to go, which is Web 102. So we're making good progress. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about JavaScript loops. So looping is just a common term in programming in general. It's something that you use quite often for looping over large sets of data and running the same operations or manipulation of a large set of data. If you want to do the same thing for every piece of data, then looping is a very valuable tool. So loops help us run a block of code multiple times as long as a condition is met. So loops always refer back to our conditional lesson, which conditions use the and or keywords, as well as less than, greater than, or equal to. You can check those conditions, and they always evaluate to true or false. And so let's see, a simple example of a while loop is here we have a variable named count, which has the value of 0. So while count is less than 5, console log hello world. So count, when it first comes through, is 0. So if is 0 less than 5, yes, I'm going to go ahead and console log world. But then I'm going to increase the count by 1. So the second time it comes through, count is now 1, which is still less than 5. So it continues. Then 1 gets added 1 to it and becomes a 2. So then it comes through a third time, and count is 2, which is still less than 5, so it's going to continue to run. Then it gets all the way up to the point where count becomes 5, and it's no longer less than 5, but it's equal to, so the loop is going to stop. So that was a basic, a pretty quick walkthrough. We'll see more examples as we get into the exercises. Another common example of a loop is the for loop, which takes 3 arguments or 3 declarations separated by a semicolon, whereas the while loop only took the one condition, only had one condition to check. So although the while loop is useful, there's a more capable way of looping in most programming languages called the for loop. So it's common throughout all programming languages, not just specific to JavaScript. So it's similar. It's also checking if something is less than 5, but it's also declaring that variable within the for block. So this is declared outside of the while block. The variable is declared inside here. Let's see. So I is 0 at first. Is 0 less than 5? Yes. So it's going to go ahead and console log the world, and then it's going to run this third condition. Plus plus is just another way of saying add 1 or increase myself by 1. And so I is going to add 1 to itself and become 2. And it's going to run this whole block again. Is 2 less than 5? Yes. Console log hello world, add 1, add plus plus or add 1 to myself. It's going to run the whole block again. Now I is 3. Is 3 less than 5? Yes. Go ahead and continue. And all the way until I equals 5, which kind of breaks this condition. And 5 is no longer less than 5. So this code block is not going to run. As long as this middle evaluates to true, it's going to run the block. As soon as it evaluates to false, it's going to exit and continue on to the line below the for block. So we'll see that in the examples. Yeah, this is just a breakdown of the components we just talked about, declaring the variable, checking the condition, and then the post iteration. So after it runs this block, it goes to this line, and I++ is just shorthand for adding 1 to itself. So let's go ahead and see how that looks in code. All right, looks like this is going to be a pretty quick lesson, just two to go through today. So maybe one about while loops. This one looks like it's about while. The next one's probably about for loops. So we'll finish this up, and then we'll be done for the day. And thanks everyone for watching and following along. If you have any questions, as always, reach out in the chat channel or visit origincodeacademy.com. And check out the Contact Us section, the numbers up there, as well as, let's see, yeah, it's probably the best way to reach us. You can always email Ryan. Actually, you can chat with Ryan down here through our Facebook chat, or you can subscribe to news. Yeah, check out our website and see if you'd like to come in for a tour, all that good stuff. But in the meantime, let's finish up this while and for loops while we're at it. So let's start and get our code in there. All right, so now what does our instruction say? Inside the function named looping, create a while loop that prints out the numbers 0 through 9. All right, so if we remember while loop, the variable can be declared outside of the block. So we'll just say while and give it our condition block, and then the actual execution block. So while we want to print up to 9, but then once it gets to 9, we want to stop. And so a condition that we could check for is x is less than 9. So this block of code will only run while x is less than 9. So we're probably going to have a way to say each time we should add 1 to x so that it increases by 1 each time. Eventually, if you add 1 to 0 and then 1 to 1, 1 to 2, eventually x will become 9, and then the while block will terminate. It will no longer execute. So how do we print something in JavaScript? We've seen this before. We just console log it. And so if we console log x, the first time x is equal to 0. So we're simply going to log a 0. Then after it logs it, we're going to add 1 to it, and now it becomes a 1. Now it runs through this while check again. It checks x against 9. 1 is still less than 9. Okay, so we're okay to print it. So now we have printed 0 and then 1. And then x is equal to 1 here. So we add 1 to that, x becomes 2. The while loop runs again. Is 2 less than 9? Yes. So we go ahead and continue to console log that. X is now equal to 2. Add 1 to 2 and you get 3. The while loop runs again. Is 3 less than 9? Yes. So we'll go ahead and log that all the way up to 9. Now, when x is 9, we actually want it to print still. So we could say where x is less than or equal to 9. So when x is 9, it comes through. Is x equal to or less than 9? Yes. Go ahead and print 9. But then as soon as we add 1 to 9, we get 10. And the while loop will run one last time. It sees that x is not less than or equal to 9. And it just jumps down now to the next line. And here we could say the while loop is done. So this line won't run until the while loop condition becomes false. So let's give that a test. I think I called console log too many times by adding that other console log. All right. There's the while loop, everybody. And finally, we're on to the for loop. So create a for loop that prints out all even numbers starting at 0 and ending in 100 in ascending order. All right. So we already have the variable x. However, we want to move that guy into our for block. And then the second declaration in our for loop is the condition or the check that we're going to do on the variable. So as long as it's less than 100, we're going to continue running this for loop. And then each time, we're going to say x plus equals 2 this time, so that we only print out the, actually, you know what? We're going to run it 100 times. However, we're only going to print the even numbers. So there's a few ways we could do that. But first, or the best way is using the modulo operator, which we talked about in a previous lesson. So as long as x modulo 2 equals 0, we can do an if check in here, an if statement, which we also learned about in previous lessons. If x modulo 2 is strict equals to 0, then we will console log x. Because 3 modulo 2 would return a 1. As we've seen before, modulo does a division and then returns the remainder from that division. And so if it can be divisible by 2, then it's an even number. Then we'll go ahead and print it. Otherwise, do nothing. And so let's give that a test. And here we want to make sure that it's less than or equal to 100. Because we want it to run that 100 on that 100 number. So when x becomes 100, we want it to continue executing. So that's it for loops. Feel free to sign up, jump in here, and practice as much as you'd like. There's no Scrimba lesson for this, so it's just the written lesson and the exercises. But you can practice as much as you'd like in the editor here. And then we're actually moving on. So next week, we will go ahead and get started with Web 101. Actually, let's give that a refresh real quick. The first lesson is about Jquery Selection. So join us next week for diving into the last 6 lessons. It looks like we have 6 sets of exercises for Web 101, and these all revolve around jQuery. So if you've heard the term jQuery before, it's running on probably definitely over 50% of websites out there today. It's a very common library used in JavaScript that allows you to easily manipulate the DOM or easily manipulate the elements on your web page. So a very cool lesson coming up next week. Join us at the webinar. And if you haven't already done so, go ahead and sign up at prep.origincodecademy.com, and you can have completely free access to all of these courses that we've been going through. And then if you visit the YouTube channel for Origin Code Academy, then just give a search for Origin Code Academy. And let's see, where is the prep walkthrough? If you go to our channel, there's a playlist called OCA Prep Course Walkthrough Series. So you can visit this and you can see all of our previous webinars. And the first one, we were in the very first course, Web 100. So we started all the way at the beginning. We went through every lesson together. If you're just starting the pre-work or the prep course, then you can jump back in here and we actually walk through each lesson together. So if you're ever stuck, you can visit the playlist on our YouTube. And you can always join us live for these webinars every Wednesday at 5:30. Next Wednesday is 4th of July, so we will not be doing a webinar. But the following Wednesday, we'll pick up from where we left off in Web 101. So thanks, everybody, for joining us this week. We just got through 3 exercises. It was a great day. We learned a lot. And look forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks.